the wind held around the house slamming against the front door and made her thankful for the sumptuous blankets on top of her, but as her eyes blinked open into surprising darkness, she realized that at some point after she'd fallen asleep, the fire had gone out. A draft pulled in from somewhere and seemed to hunt Brea down, chilling her inside and out. Brea cocked her head. Was the place haunted, or with the sound she kept hearing nothing more than George pacing in his room above her? She was ready for the night to be over so she wouldn't have to share a roof with the cocky bastard any longer. She only wanted to get home to her family to somehow win Eric back and show her parents that she wasn't a complete failure. And maybe also she'd feel a little relief at being away from George and the brutally honest way he'd called her out on her behavior. She had been rude and quick to judge, and maybe a little too credulous regarding a public image that had been created by tabloids, based more on what would sell than what was actually true. He might have been somewhat unkind, but she'd also been unfair, and she didn't like to remember that. Didn't like to think of herself that way. She wasn't one to count out to people with power, but there was a difference between not fawning over someone and not treating them with basic courtesy. Footsteps again, this time on the stairs behind her, making their way to the first floor. Brea huddled under the blanket. She didn't want to face him, so maybe if she just pretended to be asleep, he would ignore her. He moved closer to the couch, and she could feel him lean over the back and linger above her for a moment. Brea squeezed her eyes tightly and willed her body to be still, but it had a mind of its own, and she shuddered. "Are you cold?" Brea jumped, startled by his voice. She opened her eyes, and there he was, staring down at her with a piercing gaze, shirtless. She swallowed hard and pulled the blanket towards her chin. "I could build the fire up for you again if you'd like." It wasn't a question, but merely a statement. He'd already moved to the fireplace and thrown open the oversized mesh screen and tossed in 2 logs. "No, I'm fine, thank you," she protested automatically. "It's freezing down here and you're shivering. I'll be quick and let you get back to sleep." She wasn't going to tell him that she couldn't sleep. A strange man, strange house on a strange Christmas. She wasn't going to get any sleep, no matter how warm and cozy he made it for her. She just needed morning to get here, so that whether with Mr. Clark's associates or by the tow truck driver, she could get out of here. "Would you like another blanket?" The fire had sparked behind him, and even without her glasses sitting against her nose, she could see the firm outline of his chest, his broad shoulders, his toned stomach, naked in the chilled winter air. She wouldn't allow her eyes to linger, though she found herself searching him even in the dark for scrapes or burns. As she imagined a bullet grazing his skin, there was something that felt dangerous about being here with a man who had been shot at only hours before. She glanced away, but the image was burned into her mind as she mentally trailed her fingers across his lightly tanned skin, her fingertips stumbling nervously over hard nipples, her nails tracing down to his hips and under that stretchy band of his plaid pajama pants. Squeezing her eyes tightly, she wheeled the image away. She wasn't going to let him into her fantasies, no matter how good he looked half naked. "What are you getting at here with all of this sudden concern for me, Mr. Clark?" Why the change of heart? She could see him struggling with his words as he sat at the far end of the couch, as far from her as he could manage. She scowled. "I'm sorry for being abrupt," he said. "It has been a rather long day for me." "So I've heard," she murmured under her breath, and with that some more embarrassment set and aimed at her own behavior. He had gone through something genuinely terrible, and it couldn't have been pleasant to end up with a stranger in his home when he must have already been feeling vulnerable. The silence hung between them. She was unsure of what to say. She felt like she should apologize too, but she couldn't think of how to frame it without admitting that she'd come into his house with some pretty negative assumptions made without a lot of basis. She still wasn't going to be nominating him for Man of the Year, but maybe she'd been too hasty in thinking that he was the Grinch come to life in an absurdly attractive body. She sat up, pulling the blanket to her chin, holding it tightly around herself like a shield, not from the cold but from him and from the attraction she kept feeling toward him, even though she knew with absolute certainty that it was a terrible idea. She suddenly felt very uncomfortable with him in the room. She was beginning to sweat beneath the layers, but the fire was barely a flicker. "She wished you would put a shirt on already." Whether he intended it or not, he was awfully distracting. She faced forward, avoiding the figure That was on the farther end of the couch. She pressed herself into the armrest, wishing she could put more distance between them. This is the first time I've shared the cabin with anyone since I was a teen. She was unsure if he was speaking to her or more to himself, making a self-observation. She chose not to answer and to allow the silence to hang between them. Again the fire was roaring, now filling the room with heat. After a few minutes George spoke again. I keep the furnace low because I like wood heat. He paused for a moment, but Brea said nothing beats the warmth and glow of a fireplace. Don't you agree? She was shocked at his nearly romantic works. They weren't the kind of thing she'd have expected him to say or even feel. She smiled, cocking her head in his direction before realizing how his bare chest seemed to glow in the firelight, and then quickly snapping her head forward again. Yes, I do agree. It makes me think of happy times, family, love. She stopped, not having meant for the last word to slip out. It felt odd that she should say such a thing in front of him, even if there were no implications that she meant him. Whether all the rumors about him were true or not, there was no denying he'd been seen with lots of different women. True lasting love didn't seem to be on his agenda. Happy times, the man grunted to himself. Yes, I suppose that you grew up in a very close loving family and have many wonderful memories to hold on to. Was she imagining it, or was his tone slightly envious? She hesitated. She might be in his home and sharing his couch, but she didn't know him well enough to share the unhappiness of her childhood. Besides, he'd achieved his success by being a ruthlessly driven businessman. She couldn't imagine he made much time in his life for softer emotions. So would he even understand what she's been through, how it had hurt her? He seemed like the type to tell her that she should use her struggles to make herself stronger. She hated advice like that. Her struggles hadn't made her superhuman, they had just made her used to struggling. Was there strength in that? Maybe, but there was weakness too. She was so very tired of having to struggle. When it came to the people who were supposed to accept her unconditionally, it left her vulnerable in odd ways, made her easier to hurt. She didn't want to get into any of that, so she needed to pivot the conversation, to lead it in a different direction. Not much of his youth had been in the media. The only thing that she did know of his childhood was that he was an only child. The very idea seemed strange to her. She couldn't imagine having grown up alone, not with her parents. Had his been better? What about your childhood? She prodded. What are your parents like? She could feel him looking at her, but couldn't read his expression through the dark and the blurriness of still not having her glasses on. She reached for them now, but when she looked back at him, he had turned away, again staring into the flickering flames. Maybe there was a reason that the only personal life that anyone knew of was flamboyant and extreme. Maybe the truly personal things, the things that he held close and dear, he refused to let anyone touch, friend or foe. Suddenly Mr. Clark had become a mystery that Brea wanted very badly to crack.